Hey folks, it's Nate. It's time I got back to the drawing board, and tonight we're back with another episode of Book Club. We're looking at chapter 6 of Naoki Urasawa's Monster, and this is where things really start to heat up. You can tell by the body bags right here on this page. We are jumped forward about 9 to 10 years in time from the previous chapter, or really from the bulk of the previous chapter, because if you recall on the last page, we do see that it is now 1995. We are still in Germany. This setup is here in Cologne, but again, most of the story of this chapter is in Dusseldorf. And this is where we really start to see the consequences for Dr. Kenzo Tenma's decisions in the 5 chapters leading up to this. And this is where we start to see a little bit of the heat come on, a little bit of the pressure, but not the full scope of things just yet. That's coming, but this is a little bit of setup. This is not a slow setup, though. We are on fire now, or we are at least flooded out, as you can see on this page. So this is there's a flood in Cologne, Germany in 1995. A couple of bodies wash out of a house, and our favorite character, Inspector Lunge, shows up to investigate what these bodies are doing. Most of these first couple of pages are just exposition. They serve to set up a scenario where a number of childless, middle-aged couples of upper middle class wealth level are dying, or more accurately, being murdered, and Inspector Lunge is investigating these murders. He has a suspect who he believes is at least an accessory to the murder, not necessarily the murder, but rather the person who has helped the murderer break into the houses of the victims, and he's trying to track him down. Okay, so there's the setup. After this, we go to a check-in on Tenma. This is really pretty quick and just confirms to us that he's the head of surgery at the Eisler Memorial Hospital in Dusseldorf. He's kind of keeping to himself. He's still working with Dr. Becker, and he's still working primarily for the safety of his patients. So his character hasn't really changed over the decade between the deaths of the previous head of the surgery at the hospital and now. Tenma is still steering that course. He's still the man of strong character who is primarily focused on the good of his patients. So that's all set up, confirming that even though there's been a time skip, our character hasn't changed radically. And then we get to the action. So Inspector Lunge's suspect gets hit by a car. The person who's driving the car claims that, what was his name? Because he has a name. Adolf Junkers. So Mr. Junkers was chased out into the street, according to the person who hit him. And as he is a primary person of interest in this case that Lunge is in trying to investigate, he follows up this at the hospital, and they have Dr. Tenma called in. Now, he goes to Cologne, even though he's not a regular doctor in there. He's apparently on call or available to be loaned or something. Again, I don't know how the medical system works in Germany. Presumably this is something that happens on a semi-regular basis. I don't know how often that could happen practically. That kind of raises a question mark for me. But, it gets him to where he needs to be in the story, so let's not really worry about it. The main point here is to show that Inspector Lunge is still investigating these murders from a decade ago, remembering all the details with that impressive disk drive memory system of his. And it establishes that Tenma he's just really not concerned about it. Again, if you had any questions about whether Tenma was guilty of these murders that we saw in the previous chapter, this would kind of continue to suggest he is innocent, because he doesn't show any guilty tells. He doesn't really try and engage with the inspector as you might expect a guilty person to do. He's really not concerned with the questions at all. He just wants to go in and do the surgery so he can save someone's life, because that's the kind of character Tenma is. That is the moral core of his personality. He's a doctor who saves lives. and more power to him. He's not really a murderer, you wouldn't think. And again, this whole conversation kind of serves to reinforce that. But it also shows that Inspector Lunge is very suspicious of Dr. Tenma. And here you see him saying, the only person that stood to benefit from all of these deaths is you, Dr. Tenma. He's not saying that directly to Tenma's face. This is more, of course, the character delivering some exposition to us, the audience, while looking pretty cool doing it. Because let's face it, that's a nice. Again, we see Naoki's Urasawa's gift for really conveying a lot about a character in the way they look, and we don't see anticipation, we don't see malice, we don't see anger or a desire to really drive this home to Tenma. He is not a Javert. Inspector Lunge just knows what he knows, and he knows what that information suggests, and he wants to make the connection. Lunge says he has never failed to close a case, and there may be a certain degree of professional pride in that, but he's also a very even-tempered, even-keeled kind of a man, as we can see just in the way he's shown on these pages. He always has these very even expressions. He never looks worked up over anything. He wants to... He's investigating Tenma because all the evidence in the case points to Tenma, and he wants to close the case. And this sets up Lunge as a very admirable antagonist. And he is an antagonist to Tenma in this story. That's what these chapters are establishing. He's not an evil man. He simply doesn't know everything that we know about Tenma, and so he is convinced that Tenma must be guilty of a murder. He just can't prove it. And until he can prove it, he's going to play the game as it should be played and ask the questions he can ask and gather what evidence he can and try and trip up Tenma wherever he can, because he kind of has to. That's how an investigation works. And yeah, he's going to be a jerk some in the future, but he's doing it because he has admirable motives. And this chapter, more so than his introduction in the previous chapter, serves to establish those facts. So here we have the introduction of two very interesting plot elements. We have the introduction of these murders that Lunge is investigating, which are going to be important to Tenma somehow. And we have the introduction of an antagonist. Since the hospital director and his cronies are now dead, Tenma needs an antagonist, and we're not quite ready to introduce the real antagonist of the entire story. So instead we have Inspector Lunge, who is a great character and a very interesting antagonist. More on him coming in later chapters. So at the end of this, we see Dr. Tenma. He's saved Mr. Junker's life, which is great. Exactly what we would expect of Dr. Tenma at this point. So long as he gets to surgery before they expire, he's pretty much guaranteed to save anyone he operates on. That's a testament to his skill as a surgeon and, kind of as his status as the protagonist. Let's be honest. He is going to save his patients 9 times out of 10. And that's pretty much all that happens in this chapter. It's a good case study in how to do a time skip well, because it doesn't upset too many parts of the status quo that we had at the end of the previous time period. Tenma is still a doctor. He still has the same moral fiber at the heart of his character. He is still doing what he was doing before, just in a slightly increased capacity. Of course, he's now being called into other hospitals rather than just operating in his own hospital. But he is surrounded by new challenges, as we see in the form of Inspector Lunge, as we see in the introduction of these new murders as personified by Mr. Junkers. So not a whole lot has changed, but enough has changed to present Tenma with new challenges and new hurdles, which will take him in new directions. Now, we think that it's going to be this murder investigation, but that's not actually what it is. As we can see on the last page, we are reminded that this is not simply a story about doctors and police and murders. It's the story of a monster. I'll see you in Chapter 7.